Welcome to the New Thinking for a New World podcast, where we explore the most pressing issues that are challenging and changing our societies. We are looking for new thinking and new solutions wherever we can find them. Listen as host Alan Stoga, the Thalberg Foundation's chairman, challenges his guests for analysis, ideas and actions. Together, we can help make our world at least a bit better.
We live in a complicated, conflicted world. Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine, U.S. and European efforts to punish Russian aggression in ways that challenge the basic rules of financial and commercial globalization, China's growing geopolitical and military assertiveness, not the least as measured by increasing threats to repatriate Taiwan. Even Japan and Germany, long advocates of soft power, have announced they will rearm in the face of rising global threats. What about India? Today, it's the world's sixth largest economy and famously the world's largest democracy. But it aims higher. Prime Minister Modi recently declared that the country must accelerate its growth and development in the coming decades. By 2050, only China and the U.S. are likely to have larger economies. But that might be the easy part. India shares a border of more than 2,000 miles with China and has fought the Chinese repeatedly, as recently as 2020. It seems inevitable that India and China will butt heads as both countries become stronger. And to add a twist, Russia, China's declared best friend forever, is India's largest arms supplier. As I said, it's complicated. My guest today, Raja Mohan, is well positioned to help us pick apart some of those complications. He is an Indian academic, journalist, and foreign policy expert, a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Delhi. This is his beat. Welcome, Raja, to New Thinking for a New World.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for hosting me today.
Let's start with the war in Ukraine. India, like most countries in the world, in fact, has not condemned the Russia invasion and is reportedly buying discounted Russian oil and other things. So no sanctions. Your country's relationship with Russia is long, deep, and positive. Two questions. How is the government thinking about its relationship with Russia, and how should they be thinking about it?
For Delhi, I think the problem is of managing the path dependence on Russia, that for almost 60 years, we've had a relationship with Russia. But in the last 20, the weight of Russia in India's economic orientation has seen steady decline. Trade with Russia is really today smaller than India's trade with Bangladesh. But Russia has a niche in India's domestic and external security calculus, that as a major supplier of arms to India and as a supplier of advanced nuclear systems, Russia then has had a privileged place. But this is really about India's past, its past relationships. And I think the Ukraine crisis and the war is, I think, willy-nilly going to persuade India to diversify further away from Russian arms, to find a near-term alternative, because it's not clear if Russia can actually be a reliable supplier, given the kind of performance of its armed forces in Ukraine and its focus on rearming itself in the coming decades. So it doesn't make much sense for India to continue to depend on Russian weapons. But the inventory is still Russian. So therefore, I think we'll have to find innovative solutions to reduce the dependence on Russia. And here, the emphasis of Prime Minister Modi has been on producing more weapons at home and producing more with the help of private Indian capital as well as private Western capital. So I think actually the West has an opportunity here to work with India to reduce further the weight of Russia in India's national security calculus. So I think the crisis helps us look at ways of overcoming the Russia problem in the India's deepening relationship with the US and the West.
You've recently written, in effect, that India should call a spade a spade. Russia's invasion violates, you wrote, internationally recognized border and needs to be called out. In effect, you just said that. But that doesn't mean breaking off relations. It doesn't mean the kind of Western condemnation, the sort of morality high ground that has been so popular in Europe and in the United States. How do you imagine that balance between principle and practicality being achieved?
My sense is India is making it clear. It is not, its silence on this invasion does not mean it is endorsing the Russian invasion. It has to manage the weapons dependence on Russia, especially at a time when it is locked in a military standoff with China at 14,000 fleet plus on India's northern frontiers. So at this point, the vulnerability to any supply disruption from Russia is serious. And therefore, for India, it has to navigate this delicately. And my sense is it's so far so good. Although there is quite clearly, there's a lot of criticism of India in the Western media. I give a lot of credit for the Biden administration to be empathetic to India's concerns, to recognize where India is coming from, and to underline the United States' long-term interest in working with India to produce a stable balance of power in China. To simplify, the Russia problem does not mean the China problem disappears, and India's importance in producing a balance of power framework in Asia. So the administration, contrary to the commentariat, has been smart in handling Indian issue, and the Indians are building up further with the United States in the Quad and other frameworks.
Let me pull on one thread. The U.S. administration has been loud about sanctions, but quite careful about enforcing secondary sanctions. So hence, India, Indonesia, lots of countries, China, are importing more energy, and I suspect food and other things from Russia than they did before the invasion. If that balance continues from the point of the U.S., that's fine. But how would India react if indeed, as the war drags on, a call for increased enforcement of sanctions gets louder and louder?
I would just say at this point, buying Russian oil is not illegal. I mean, under the American sanctions regime. So far, the U.S. has not put sanctions on purchase of oil from Russia. After all, Europe does it on a daily basis. India does it. China does it. But if by December there are new set of rules on, either it's a price cap or some other mechanism, India will have to take a fresh look at its policy. My sense is India stands to benefit, assuming there is a price cap agreed upon by the Western countries. Right now, it's not clear if Germany actually backs it. If there is a price cap, it suits India because it will pay even less for the Russian oil, because the US plan is not to reduce the flow of oil out of Russia, but to reduce the inflow of foreign exchanges into Russia. So therefore, if the price cap works, India is not going to complain. Now, if it will be happy to pay a lower price for the Russian oil. And if it doesn't work, and if the West itself is divided on how to deal with the Russian invasion, so it is not a problem then for India in the near term. But I think India does understand the scale of the crisis in Europe. And if you put India's position in relation to where Germany is, where you protect Germany, Americans protect Germany, Americans defend Germany, while Germany's trade and political relationship with Russia has grown, India is not dependent on United States for security. India is not a treaty ally. So I think, given that comparison, my sense is the administration is quite understanding of where India stands and working with India to further deepen the bilateral partnership on a range of issues, including on the oil question, including on the energy question, and on the weapons issue. My sense is this will only open up more opportunities for India and the US and the West to work together.
The downside of the price cap, of course, is that it's supposedly to be executed by politicizing insurance. That is to say, we would extend our current tendency to politicize transactions globally to the insurance business. If the oil is mispriced, no insurance, and hence you can't move it. Does that approach to international trade and commerce from Washington, and indeed from the European capitals, we make the rules, and I want to get back to the rules-based order later on. We make the rules to serve our purposes. How is that viewed in Delhi?
You deal with the world as it is, Alan. I mean, it's not that you can tell the West, look, guys, you're violating your own rules. As I think there was a time when India used to do that, stand up and speak up on moral politic of talking about the right and wrongs in the world. But today, India has to deal with the realities outside. The weaponization of interdependence has already taken place in a big way. I mean, I won't just blame the US. China has done it in terms of how it has manipulated the global trading system to its own advantage. The US is weaponizing its dominance over the financial system to cope with the crisis in Europe. So that's a reality, and I think India will deal with it. But I don't see India, standing up in the old days and saying, "Look, these are illegal. What's being done is unfair." But the world is unfair. When has it not been?
And it will forever be. Well, let's switch to China. You recently wrote that, and I quote, "China is convinced it now has the power to redeem its historic territorial claims vis-a-vis India and other Asian neighbors." When I read that, I immediately thought of the mantra that you hear from the Chinese all the time, Asia for the Asians, which I really think means Asia for the Chinese in their formulation. That said, Western politicians tend to see dominance in Asia to China almost by default in their thinking, at least. Do you?
No, in fact, Indians are not in doubt at all that when the Chinese say Asia for Asians, they actually mean telling everyone to accept Chinese hegemony over Asia. In fact, our foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has said the idea that the Chinese slogan Asia for Asians is really a self-serving one. So there was a time when Indians used to believe in this argument. After all, India was one of the conveners of the idea of the Asian Relations Conference going back to 1947. India long believed in Asian solidarity. But thanks to the Chinese and what they've done in the region, today India is much wiser. I don't think it's just taken in by Chinese rhetoric and Chinese terms of Chinese discourse. And I think one of the problems with the West has been they've tended to debate on China's terms, taking every bit of the Chinese propaganda as some kind of a mystical thing that has to be analyzed and explained. So in that sense, you realize, forget the common sense, that all great powers try and present their own interests as universal interests or regional interests. And China is doing just the same. So for Japan, that is at the receiving end of Chinese military power, or in India, that is finds its territory under threat from Chinese aggression, they don't believe this. Just as going back to the 1930s, the Chinese did not believe in the Japanese claim that they were going to build Asia for Asians. They were going to liberate Asia from the Western imperialists. So we've seen this game before. So I don't think anybody's fooled by that.
They're not fooled by it, but they have to cope with it. China is a rising power, the rising power. India is also a rising power. I said at the top that it seems from a great distance almost inevitable that the headbutting that has characterized the relationship between China and India over the years is likely to intensify, especially given the approach the Chinese are taking. They clearly intend to dominate Asia. Indeed, I think they intend to dominate the globe. Besides behaving with their eyes wide open, what should India's leaders be doing to anticipate that Chinese aggression, which certainly seems inevitable, at least from a great distance?
I will slightly modify your proposition that China and India are rising powers. In fact, China has risen already. India is rising. And for quite some time to come, the gap between the comprehensive national power of China and India will be in favor of China. That's a reality today. For example, Chinese GDP is almost 5 times larger than India's. Its military spending is 4 times larger than India's. So I think the gap is real. And as China turns to as China tries to turn this gap into territorial advantage, India has only one option, which is to get closer to the United States and Japan to find ways to limit China's expansionism in Asia. But that's exactly what we've done. In fact, over the last 3 years, since the Chinese aggressiveness on the border, India's engagement with the US has steadily grown. India's military cooperation, security cooperation with the US and its allies has significantly increased. So we're doing the right thing, perhaps the only thing, which is we need the West, we need the US to be able to balance the Chinese. I mean, so earlier, we were romantic about China, romantic about building a partnership with China to build a post-Western order in Asia. But today, that unless we bring in the Americans, unless we have a Western role in Asia, we are not going to have a stable balance of power system. Therefore, we need an open-ended, fully, in which the US and the West fully participate in, is critical to make sure that there's a reasonable balance of power in Asia. And there's some constraints on Chinese unilateralism in how it deals with its neighbors.
Let me push you on that, because the question of the American so-called pivot to Asia has been hanging out there like a dangling participle for a number of years now, declared but not executed in any real substantial way. Clearly, the war in Ukraine has, to some extent, caused a reversal, troops moving back into Europe, massive spending aimed at European defense, the expansion of NATO, et cetera, with some little bits and pieces of conversations, even not alliances, but new relationships on the security side in Asia. But surely it's easy to look at where we are now and wonder if the Americans, never mind the Europeans, would be a substantial support for India if Chinese aggression took more concrete forms on your borders.
There are two issues here. One, I would say the US has not taken its eyes off Asia because of the Ukraine crisis or of the perennial, problems in the Middle East. Over a period of time, I mean, the US talked about the pivot, but might not have moved the forces in a big way. But its levels of engagement with Asia have been very high. And the Quad under the Biden administration has been elevated to the summit level. And we see a lot of US involvement in the region. Second, unlike in Europe, where the US has to lift much of the weight, the Europeans don't pay for their own defense. They like the welfare state. While the Americans have to keep paying for it. In Asia, at least Japan and India, they're signaling they're going to do their share. They're going to do more than that. So it's not that India is not a treaty partner. It's not expecting American soldiers to come into the Himalayas and join them to fight the Chinese. India can do it itself. So I think the US that helps India to balance China, the US that helps Japan to secure the technological capabilities to balance China. We will do the rest. That's where we are different from the Europeans. We feel this threat intensely, and we're going to do it for our own interests. And the US role, from being the force that does everything to a force that facilitates the construction of a regional balance of power, would be much easier than US bringing its troops all over Asia, trying to stand up against the Chinese. So in that strategy, India has a huge role, and India is ready to play that role. And we've seen in the last crisis, the US did give us some assistance on intelligence, on giving us data on what was happening on the Chinese side. So that is very useful. So India is not looking for, as the Europeans do, American troops to come in, stand in the Central European frontier with Russia. So this is a different situation. And my sense is, at this point, I don't think Delhi has any complaints against Washington that it's not supporting enough, or that we expect more from the United States.
If you feel that the world lacks global leaders, please help support the Thalberg Foundation programs. Individual donations are being accepted at thalbergfoundation.org/donate. That's TALLBERG foundation.org/donate.
So going forward, you could imagine some kind of Delhi-Tokyo axis backstopped by the United States that would, in Kissingerian terms, support a stable balance of power in Asia that would keep China at least, if not contained, at least constrained in its aggression.
Exactly. That's, you got it exactly right. That this is about the debate on burden sharing in Europe, which never really took off. Here, you're talking about actually facilitating your friends and partners to develop their capabilities, to be able to stand up against Chinese expansionism. And I think that's a good strategy, because this is not one imposed by the United States that would, go straight into the Chinese propaganda framework. So helping Asia defend itself against China has a much better chance of working than one where the US says, I'm going to defend Asia against China. So my sense is we are on the right track to be able to produce that local coalitions to deal with the Chinese power.
Sort of a sidebar, I'm curious, do you think the Chinese are serious about doing something vis-a-vis Taiwan in the short run?
No, I said they're rattling the cage. They're making a lot of noise. But if you're sitting in Zhongnan in the Chinese political headquarters, you're going to see the famous Russian army has not done too well inland, where they're supposed to be dominant, right next door in Ukraine, which is a country that was part of them. The idea that Chinese troops, Chinese forces can simply cross the channel and take over Taiwan, I think the US has enough capability to deter that, and the US is strengthening those capabilities. So my sense is Xi Jinping can't afford a draw if he takes a risk of attacking Taiwan, because anything short of total victory would be a defeat for him. While Japan, US, Australia, a whole lot of Asian, forces are enough to take at least an arm of Chinese aggression. So I think my sense is the Chinese would be cautious. They would raise the heat, but I doubt if they will actually go in to take over Taiwan.
At least anytime soon.
And I would just want to add one more thing here, which is the Chinese have had no experience in fighting modern wars. So they might have the world's second largest defense spending and a powerful, military modernization that has taken place, but they remain very untested to be able to really embark on something like this and to pull away and to pull it off. So my sense is caution would eventually prevail in Beijing.
This is an important point because, like in all things, practice matters. And you are right. The last time the Chinese fought a big war is now well in the past. And it was a very different kind of war than what they are now building the capability for. You don't just create a Navy overnight and suddenly it's effective, or an Air Force overnight and suddenly it's effective. It's a terribly important point. Let me segue to something we already mentioned, the rules-based order. There's an enormous amount of talk about it, particularly in Europe and the United States, which, of course, to us means our rules and our order. The Chinese have been rude recently in pointing out that they agree with the notion of a rules-based order, just don't think it should be written by 12% of the world's population for the other 88% of the population. That, of course, is self-serving, but of course it's self-serving. How do we evolve a new rules-based order that, in fact, is relevant in Delhi and in Beijing, as well as in Washington and Berlin?
Look, once again, I think the Chinese propaganda is clever, but it doesn't stand close scrutiny. I mean, Chinese benefited from the U.S. rules until now. U.S. probably is regretting getting the Chinese into the World Trade Organization today. But the fact is, they've been immense beneficiaries of the global system. But unlike Deng Xiaoping and his immediate successors, Xi Jinping thinks he can build his own world order and wants to reshape the regional balances, gain more control over the region and on the international system. So it is not saying, look, whose rules? But sitting in India, at least, there's one rule all of us have always agreed on, which is you don't take your neighbor's territory by force. And I think their respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states, and that any change in borders must come by peaceful means. Now, that is fundamental to the UN Charter. And here, both Russia and China are fundamentally trying to overturn the principle. If Washington was smart, it should have presented the Ukraine crisis not as a confrontation between autocracies and democracies, but as violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another member of the United Nations. I think that would have gotten you a lot more support because that's easy to understand. Europeans might think they're in a post-sovereign world, they're into this great world of norms, but as Russians reminded them, they're not in such a world. And that for us, we are conscious of our sovereignty, we're conscious of our territorial integrity. No nation in the developing world underestimates the importance of these concepts. So framing it, look, you simply can't send in your troops to take over another country on the basis of the claim that the other nation has no right to exist, which is what Russia has done in Ukraine. In the East, here, China has sliced off territory in the South China Sea, and it has violated every single norm. There are rules, which is simple rules, which is the World Court has said China was wrong on every count of its claim in the South China Sea. But Chinese have simply altered the facts on the ground. They've violated the commitments on Hong Kong. Now they want to simply take over Taiwan, and they want to take over parts of Indian Ladakh. So here there's no room for confusion. But I think the problem is the obfuscation, the mystification of the debate on rules-based order in the Western debates. And the Chinese counter to it, I think, don't take away from the simple principle that territorial sovereignty is important. And if the borders have to be changed, they have to be done by negotiation. After all, China has agreed on these principles with us for the last 30 years and violated them today because China thinks it can get away with it. And I think our job is to tell them, to show them that they can't get away with it.
I think that's well put, because part of the problem and I suspect the reason the United States did not make the case as you suggested it should have, is that we too violate that principle all the time when it is convenient, whether it's Grenada or Panama or Iraq. The list goes on, and we find our own justification, usually on high moral grounds, for doing so. So to make the case, even American diplomats have a little trouble making a case that they know they have violated and will violate again in the future. And I think that is part of the problem of global governance at the moment, which is to say there are at least two sets of rules, those for the great powers and those for everybody else. And that is the flaw in the argument, I'm afraid.
I would just add one caveat to that. You're right that, look, major powers, make their own rules. But the fact is that the US has used force. It has violated sovereignty of other countries. But it has not said it wants to absorb Afghanistan into the United States. I know it will be too expensive, or why would you want to do it? Or said Iraq is going to be part of the United States. So I think that is a fundamental difference between the US military interventions and the Russian occupation of Ukraine today, claiming that Ukraine belongs to them, or the Chinese claims that the territory around them belongs to them. I think that is the difference between the US military interventions of the last 200 years and the Chinese and the Russian territorial aggression and expansionism today.
It's an excellent point. I agree entirely with you. Borders matter, and peace and stability require the agreement that borders matter. Which raises my final question. You have argued that India needs a new foreign policy. Why, I understand. The world and India are changing rapidly. What do you see as the key elements of a new approach? You've talked about some of it. I can imagine reshaping, creating, alliance may be too strong a word, but new relationships with countries like Japan, maybe Korea, obviously a shift in focus from excess dependence on Russia to something else. But what are the basic principles you would imagine India's future foreign policy entail?
No, I would identify, three changes that are already occurring. I think one is in terms of the great power relationships. India's, in the past, India defined itself in opposition to the West, whether it is through the non-aligned movement, on a range of issues that India seemed to present itself, both as in the East-West issues as well as the North-South issues. India was a champion of the global South, and it was tilted to the East in the East-West confrontation. But today, India's relationship with the West has dramatically grown in the last 2 decades. And in the last 3 years, it has actually intensified. Today, I think for the first time, the convergence of interest between India and the West are real, and the governments in Delhi are today far more conscious of that, and they see the value of an India that has stronger partnership with the West. And the economic orientation of India, the post-reform orientation of India, has seen greater economic engagement with the West rather than with Russia or, for that matter, with China. Second, I think there is no contradiction between the Western interests in Asia, which was India's neighborhood, and India's own interests. Both of us have a common interest in constructing a stable balance of power system here. This was not the case in the Cold War, where the US supported China and we ended up in partnership with the Russians. So we are in a new situation within the regional dynamic. Third, I think on the international level, here again, the idea of like-minded coalitions, that India and the US working together, looking not to transcend the UN, but to be able to build new coalitions. Unlike in the last 30 years, where we believe that global institutions will produce answers today, it is the coalitions between like-minded countries, coalitions like the Quad, coalitions like the other areas where we are beginning to work together. I would say those are beginning to happen. So I would say the greater collaboration with the West, greater convergence of interest with the West in the region, and a new global governance where India works with the Western countries to develop like-minded coalitions. All these are the new elements of India's foreign policy that are already visible.
If the United States was wise enough to redo the G7, should India be one of the 7?
I would say there's been talk about a G10. The proposal was there. British certainly tried to push it of India, Australia, and South Korea being part of the G7. And in fact, they're being continuously invited. So my sense is the core idea is already there, that you need to expand the coalition to bring in Asian powers into it beyond Japan. And my sense is it's bound to happen one way or another, whether you do it formally today, tomorrow, that you need India, South Korea, Australia, and other Asian countries to be able to join this coalition to build a more stable and prosperous world.
My proposal would be to disinvite some of the small European countries and replace them with countries that actually will shape the future. And I think just listening and chatting for the last half hour, clearly India is one of the countries that will shape the next decades. Thank you, Raja, for the conversation. I'm a fan. I enjoy your writing. Keep on doing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Len. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Please rate our show on Apple Podcast and subscribe. Meanwhile, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter at tallbergfoundation.org to learn more about our work. That's TALLBERG foundation.org. Thank you, and we'll be back again next week for another episode of Tallberg's New Thinking for a New World. This podcast was brought to you through the generous support of SNF, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.